Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The vile emperor was initially suspicious of what was happening, and even the saint emperor thought that it was impossible. As Archaeans, they knew how difficult it was to reach the Archaean realm, some of which pertained to a secret that no other cultivators in the eternal immortal domains were aware of. It had been many years since both the vile emperor and the saint emperor came to realize that it would be very difficult for another Archaean to appear in the eternal immortal domains. After all, in order to become an Archaean, one had to gain the approval of the world. That approval was not merely some nod of the head. It involved acquiring some of the chi flow of the world itself, essentially, taking some of its natural laws. That was the only way to become an Archaean, and thus, both the vile emperor and the saint emperor were suspicious about the situation. Although few others were aware of it, both of them knew that the Eternal Mother was very weak. Therefore, even if Bai Xiaochun could do things that surpassed the celestial realm, neither of the other emperors could believe that he had actually become an Archaean. However, there was little time to ponder the situation now, as Bai Xiaochun and the vile emperor began to fight back and forth with complete ferocity. A boom that surpassed the crash of heavenly thunder rolled out, and the vile emperor staggered backward, blood oozing out of the corners of his mouth, his eyes shining with intense killing intent. "Son," he shouted. Suddenly, the sky above the eternal immortal domains began to grow dark, as though the light were being sucked away. In the blink of an eye, all of that light appeared above the vile emperor in the form of a bright red sun. It was huge, and emanated stupefying heat. At the same time, black flames sprang up, connecting with it and making it seem like an extension of the vile emperor himself. The residents of Vile Emperor City were trembling in fear, and backing away as quickly as they could. However, many of them were too slow, and were instantly transformed into dried-up corpses by the power of the sun. Screams rang out everywhere as the black flames and the burning sun were sent directly toward Bai Xiaochun. The pressure from this sun vastly surpassed that from the bone dragon. It seemed hot enough to bake the entire world. Eyes flickering, Bai Xiaochun backed up and began to perform an incantation gesture. Sutra of Present Life and Death. It was the second divine ability from the time immemorial codex. As he waved his hands out in front of him, an ancient stone gate materialized, bursting with an aura of death. This gate representing dying, and was none other than the gate of death. Simultaneously, another gate appeared behind the sun, a gate that thrummed with life force and vitality. It was the gate of life. This was Bai Xiaochun's Sutra of Present Life and Death. He created two gates, one of life and one of death, and as the sun moved away from the gate of life and toward Bai Xiaochun, it approached the gate of death. That journey represented the passage from life into death. The instant Bai Xiaochun's divine ability appeared, the heaven-shaking, earth-shattering sun began to grow dark. However fast it moved, the effects of death moved faster, and could not be reversed. And since the vile emperor was connected to the sun, he began to age visibly. Even his brightly glittering eyes began to grow dark. Everyone present was struck speechless, and as for the saint emperor, he felt like he was going crazy. That magical technique is so domineering. Next, a defiant shout erupted from the vile emperor, who knew that he had only one option to deal with this magical technique. "Detonate," he shouted. Instantly, the fading sun exploded, sending out a terrifying shockwave that flattened nearby mountains and killed a large number of Vile Emperor City residents. When Bai Xiaochun fought, he did his best to protect the people watching. But the vile emperor didn't care at all about the bystanders. All he wanted to do was hurt Bai Xiaochun, and if that meant killing other people, he didn't mind. As the horrific scene played out, Bai Xiaochun flew back at top speed, unleashing the power of his cultivation base to protect himself against the detonation of the sun. Then, he prepared to unleash a counter-attack, only to find that the vile emperor was now staring at him with an expression of unswerving determination. "I don't know how you got this Archaean battle prowess, Bai Xiaochun, but I'm going to show you that, without the approval of the world around you, you can never match a true Archaean." The vile emperor then reached down and made a grasping motion in the direction of that astonishing trident. "Trident of Emperors," he growled. In response, the gargantuan trident which was currently stuck into the ground trembled, and then slowly rose up into the air, simultaneously shrinking down to the point where the vile emperor could easily grab it. In that moment, cultivation base fluctuations rolled out from the vile emperor that surpassed anything in the fight so far. Behind him, a huge vortex sprang into being, which caused all of the eternal immortal domains to tremble as it spun. "This is over, Bai Xiaochun." The trident was already emitting black light, and a distinct aura that Bai Xiaochun was already familiar with. It was the aura of the mortal renegade. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun now had no doubts whatsoever. The Vile Emperor was definitely a clone of the mortal renegade. He could tell that this trident was the very same magical item that had killed the true Vile Emperor. Therefore, it was likely an object belonging to the mortal renegade. Knowing what he was up against, Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath, and then unleashed every scrap of cultivation base power that he could. Incredible rumbling echoed out as another huge vortex appeared, this time behind Bai Xiaochun, vying with the Vile Emperor's vortex for domination. In that moment, both parties attacked. The Vile Emperor is putting everything on the line, the Saint Emperor thought. With that, he took a step forward and sped in the direction of the battlefield. Before the Saint Emperor could arrive, the Vile Emperor swept his trident through the air, summoning black flames, black lightning bolts, and a black wind, which took the form of a black eye. Locking down on Bai Xiaochun, the eye opened. That eye focused the power of the trident, sending it piercing through the air in a devastating attack. The eye seemed to contain the power to exterminate worlds, to eradicate everything in its path. In fact, it caused a sensation of deadly crisis to rise up within Bai Xiaochun. In that moment of crisis, Bai Xiaochun shouted, "Sutra of Future Paramita." Waving his hand, he pulled out a black stone. That stone was a chunk of flesh and blood from the huge sovereign up above in the sky, and was the very same gift that the Vile Emperor had sent upon the birth of Dabao and Xiaoxiao. By using his Sutra of Future Paramita on the stone, he was tying his fate to it, and thus to some extent, to the mortal renegade, Devil Imperator. Bai Xiaochun was well aware that his cultivation base was not sufficient to do anything to the mortal renegade. But he could use this divine ability to connect his fate to that of the Vile Emperor. After all, the Vile Emperor was a clone of the mortal renegade, of that much, Bai Xiaochun was certain. And that was the crux of his entire strategy. It was also one of his goals in his previous probing attacks. Although all of this takes some time to describe, even as Bai Xiaochun used his Sutra of the Future on the stone, the enormous eye closed in. He trembled, grunting as blood sprayed out of his mouth like a fountain, and the undying codex went to work, healing him. At the same time, although the enormous mortal renegade high above the world did not move, the Vile Emperor's face suddenly fell. Impossible. Even as the words left his mouth, a huge mass of blood erupted from his mouth, and he shivered, staggering backward several paces, his chest sunken in as though he had just sustained an unimaginably heavy blow. The most fearsome aspect of the Sutra of Future Paramita was how it connected fates. Both parties would be equally wounded, which might not have been particularly outstanding under normal circumstances. However, Bai Xiaochun had the powers of regeneration that came with the Undying Codex, as well as shocking fleshly body power. He would normally only be harmed by 60 or 70% of a full attack, any serious injuries would quickly be healed, and any light injuries were essentially gone instantly. Unless his opponent possessed similar powers of regeneration, any fight under these circumstances would be very uneven. Blood was currently spewing out of the mouth of the Vile Emperor, and as he looked at the stone in Bai Xiaochun's hand, his eyes flickered with panic. He still was ready to keep fighting, except, he still underestimated Bai Xiaochun's shamelessness. Just when he was about to move, Bai Xiaochun stuck his right hand out in front of himself and then smashed it into his own chest. A muffled thump rang out, and blood sprayed out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth as he staggered backward. The Undying Codex was powerful, and immediately went to work, but he didn't forget to cry out, "Aiya! You hit me. Ow, that hurts." The Vile Emperor's eyes went wide, and even as he prepared to unleash his next attack, another thumping sound could be heard, and blood sprayed out of his mouth. As of this point, his hair was disheveled, and he looked to be in really bad shape. "How shameless of you, Bai Xiaochun," he shouted, feeling like he was about to go insane. The humiliation he had endured so far was indescribable, and he already deeply regretted his decisions to probe Bai Xiaochun a bit. He was simply too difficult to deal with. His vile imperial crystals had been destroyed, his bone dragon sealed, and his sun had exploded. And in the end, he even ended up being injured. If that were all there were to it, he might have been able to accept it, but then Bai Xiaochun resorted to the bizarre tactic of hurting himself. The Vile Emperor couldn't properly express how crazed he felt. He normally maintained a somber visage, but thanks to Bai Xiaochun, the entire mood of the fight had completely changed. "Are you really cursing me, you old codger? If you do that, you're going to hurt my feelings." Glaring, Bai Xiaochun clenched his hand into a fist and hit himself in the pit of the stomach. Blood sprayed out of the Vile Emperor's mouth, and his lips quivered as he howled at the top of his lungs. Even as he tried to charge forward to attack, Bai Xiaochun punched himself 7 or 8 more times. In the end, the vile emperor felt like he was about to explode. In order to break the connection between the two of them, he hefted his trident and, eyes flickering with madness, began to squeeze his hand down on it. Detonate, he howled. The trident, a magical item belonging to the mortal renegade, exploded, causing a black tempest to explode out into the air, right between Bai Xiaochun and the vile emperor. Booms rang out as blood sprayed out of both of their mouths, and they staggered backward. The explosion apparently interfered with natural law, and even affected the cycle of reincarnation. As it rushed out, it severed the connection of fate that had been created by Bai Xiaochun's Sutra of Future Paramita. As that happened, and as Bai Xiaochun's wounds began to recover thanks to his undying codex, his eyes flickered with cold light. Not doing anything to hide his cultivation base any longer, he accelerated, the energy of an Archean raging around him as he bore down on the vile emperor. Worried that he wasn't going fast enough, he used his undying hex, and then, as he closed in, the mountain-shaking bash. With every moment that passed, he moved faster than before, appearing right in front of the vile emperor only a moment later. Then, as he reached out toward the vile emperor, he utilized his throat-crushing grasp. Everything was happening too quickly. Earlier, the vile emperor might have had the wherewithal to dodge, but now he was severely injured, and just didn't have what it took. Although he managed to twist his head out of the way, Bai Xiaochun's grasping attack still managed to hit his shoulder. Show me what you really look like. Bai Xiaochun roared. Gripping down hard with his hand, he began to rip the skin off the vile emperor's shoulder. The vile emperor howled and tried to back up, but that only revealed the wriggling flesh beneath his skin. As his flesh peeled off, the natural laws of the eternal immortal domains took effect, preventing him from maintaining a human form. Twitching and spasming, he transformed into a giant, blood-colored lizard. He continued to scream in rage and pain as, bereft of his protective skin, and bereft of the spiderweb covering that had protected his egg sac, he was now subject to the natural laws of the eternal immortal domains, which immediately sought to wipe him out of existence. When the huge lizard appeared, the remaining people of the vile emperor dynasty down below were completely stunned, especially the celestials who had participated in the events within the spiderweb area. They almost couldn't believe what they were seeing. That's a sovereign clone. What exactly is going on here? Impossible. This is completely impossible. The vile emperor is actually a clone of the sovereign? Countless cries of shock and alarm filled the air as the shocking truth was revealed. The vile emperor was actually a vicious, bizarre creature. Although not everyone knew where this lizard came from, the exclamations of the Celestials were heard by the surrounding cultivators, leading to widespread shock. Of course, there was no way Bai Xiaochun was going to let this opportunity pass him by. Pointing his finger at the howling lizard, he spoke in a loud voice that everyone could hear. Fellow Taoists of the eternal immortal domains. It has been years now since the vile emperor was killed by a clone of the enemy from beyond. He was skinned, and then replaced. This bizarre creature you are looking at is none other than that clone. Gasps rang out in response to his words, and immediately, people began to spread word to the rest of the eternal immortal domains. It was also in that exact same moment that the sky rippled, and the Saint Emperor stepped out into the open. When he saw that the vile emperor was now a huge lizard, he was deeply shaken. Not even he could ever have guessed that the vile emperor was actually a clone of the great enemy. Glaring coldly at the huge lizard, he said, "No wonder you freed the creature that emerged from the stone of flesh and blood that fell when the damaged fan arrived. 1. No wonder you always came up with excuses not to go check the seal that had been placed on the sovereign." Even as everyone reeled in shock, the lizard looked up with bloodshot eyes to glare at Bai Xiaochun. "You ruined all of my plans, Bai Xiaochun. And for that, you shall die." Howling, the lizard's aura began to power up to heaven-defying levels. At the same time, it was possible to see a black light glowing on the forehead of the enormous mortal renegade up in the heavens. That light healed the lizard of all its wounds, and caused his cultivation base and battle prowess to surpass anything from before, reaching unprecedented heights. Simultaneously, a figure took shape behind the lizard, which, to the shock of all onlookers, was a smaller version of the enormous sovereign. As the Saint Emperor's face fell, the lizard began to emanate a murderous aura, and shouted, "Nobody can stop the revered extermination from awakening." Then, the lizard trembled, whereupon countless black locusts exploded out from inside of him. In the blink of an eye, they covered heaven and earth alike in numbers too great to count, creating something like a black cloud. Buzzing sounds filled the air as some of them shot toward Bai Xiaochun, and others spread out to infect the surrounding cultivators. No one recognized these locusts, except for Bai Xiaochun, who had seen them before. Shaken, he recalled the mortal renegade's divine ability that he himself had witnessed within the memories of the worldly Taoist. He knew that once these locusts infected a host, that they would absorb the victim's flesh, blood, and cultivation base, and then give birth to more locusts. After releasing the locusts, the huge lizard that had once been the vile emperor began to flee, flying straight up into the sky. Bai Xiaochun was about to give chase, but then realized that these locusts were different from the ones he had seen in the memories of the worldly Taoist. These locusts all had strong cultivation bases and were incredibly fast. Apparently, they possessed strange powers that differed from the natural laws of the eternal immortal domains, which enabled them to instantly lock down on any nearby cultivator and appear in their vicinity within the shortest of moments. The Saint Emperor was already trying to attack them, but the locusts were able to simply dodge through his magical techniques and divine abilities. It was a moment of deadly crisis, and Bai Xiaochun had no time to sit around thinking about what to do. Pushing out with his right hand, he used the fourth of his major divine abilities, gravitational extermination. Space distorted, and in the blink of an eye, the power of gravity erupted around the locusts. As a result, the flow of time there changed, and the countless locusts that could disregard the natural laws of the eternal immortal domains were suddenly affected in dramatic fashion. Before any of them could react, they slowed down significantly. At the same time, the Saint Emperor's eyes glittered, aware that if the locusts were not driven away, the consequences would be dire. Now that they were slowed, he didn't hesitate to attack in full force. Bai Xiaochun left the locusts to him, blurring into motion as he shot after the lizard. Although he accelerated rapidly, the lizard was by no means slow, and it didn't seem like he would be able to catch up quickly. Snorting coldly, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand. Instantly, the air in front of him rippled as a lonely boat materialized. Stepping onto the boat, he connected to it with his divine sense, whereupon it burst upward with speed that surpassed the Archean realm. This was none other than the lonely boat from his treasured fan. Intense whistling sounds filled the entire world as the boat rocketed in pursuit of the huge lizard, whose face fell at the sight. Even as the lizard prepared to dodge, Bai Xiaochun shouted at the top of his lungs and clenched his hand into a fist, whereupon a shadowy figure appeared behind him. The figure wore imperial robes and an imperial crown, and was none other than the manifestation of his undying emperor's fist. However, this shadowy emperor's right arm was that of a sovereign. This wasn't the undying emperor's fist, this was his upgraded undying sovereign's fist. Without the slightest hesitation, he drew upon the full power of both his cultivation base and fleshly body, striking out in deadly fashion. This was the ultimate expression of his battle prowess, something impossible to resist, that could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth. Instantly, a massive vortex sprang up, like a huge mouth lunging to consume the giant lizard. As for the lizard, he was already trembling, aware that even if his cultivation base was stronger than it was, he would not be able to fight back against this fist strike. The sovereign aura in the fist strike made it impossible for the lizard to even flee. Shrieking in defiance, madness, and despair, he uttered a complex curse in an unknown language, which caused masses of black smoke to pour out of his body and form into a spike. "It's time for you to die, Bai Xiaochun." The lizard's eyes shone with madness as his body withered, his flesh and blood sucked away to power the black spike. Within moments, the lizard was gone, completely absorbed into the gigantic spike. By that point, the spike was not illusory in any sense of the word, and thrummed with a murderous aura that caused even Bai Xiaochun to tremble in fear. Without even the slightest pause, the spike transformed into a blur of light that shot toward Bai Xiaochun. An unsightly expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face as he thought back to the black spike he had seen stabbed into the forehead of the immortal imperatrix. This spike seemed to radiate the exact same type of energy. There was no time for thought or planning. Howling, he threw more power into his undying sovereign's fist, forcing it to become even stronger. In fact, the shadowy image behind him began to fade away, with the exception of the sovereign's arm. He was using the same tactic the lizard had just used, absorbing the rest of his technique and focusing the power on one area, making the sovereign aura even stronger. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun's battle prowess was even more shocking than before. The back and forth reactions took only a brief moment. Then, Bai Xiaochun's undying sovereign's fist slammed into the incoming spike, causing a massive boom to ring out, along with a shockwave that shook the world itself, and threatened to shatter the sky. Whether it was Bai Xiaochun, or the clone of the mortal renegade, both unleashed attacks that were at the ultimate peak of the Archean realm. And Bai Xiaochun had even backed his attack with some of the power of a sovereign. As for the spike, it was unbelievably domineering. At the moment of impact, the shadowy emperor that was the manifestation of the undying sovereign's fist shattered. However, the spike's aura was also significantly drained, and it changed colors from black to gray, making it look weak to the extreme. And yet, a vicious face appeared on the spike, the last bit of will belonging to the clone, which then forced the spike to accelerate toward Bai Xiaochun's forehead. Everyone who could see what was happening cried out in alarm. However, Bai Xiaochun had prepared from the very beginning to deal with this formidable spike. As it blurred toward him in a streak of gray light, he pulled out his turtle walk, whereupon a boom rang out as the two collided. The walk shivered violently, transforming into a black beam that shot back inside Bai Xiaochun. However, it had successfully blocked the spike. The shattered will of the clone let out a defiant howl and turned to flee, but was not as fast as Bai Xiaochun. As Bai Xiaochun grabbed it, his eyes flashed with a vicious glint, and he sent his divine sense out to crush the will of the clone. As the last bit of the clone's will was wiped away, a blood-curdling scream echoed out into the air. Down below, the effects of Bai Xiaochun's gravitational extermination enabled the Saint Emperor to eliminate all of the locusts. Expression unsightly, he then flew up to Bai Xiaochun's side, and looked at the gray spike he held in his hand. The spike was actually formed from flesh and blood, and emanated a shocking life force that seemed equivalent to an Archean. Although it struggled at first, after Bai Xiaochun wiped the spike clean of the will of the clone, it turned bright white, and stopped moving. Bai Xiaochun put the spike away and exchanged a worried glance with the Saint Emperor. Then the two of them looked at the enormous giant looming over them in the sky. Meanwhile, the survivors from Vile Emperor City were looking around blankly. Soon, the Celestials gathered their wits and flew up toward Bai Xiaochun to offer greetings. They brought the giant Ghost King with them, unconscious but unharmed. Bai Xiaochun had located the giant Ghost King in the early stages of the battle, and had sent some divine sense over to him as a protection. Greetings Arch-Emperor. Greetings Saint Emperor. Their polite, respectful greetings immediately showed their attitude. The Vile Emperor had turned out to be a clone, which meant that the Vile Emperor dynasty was no more. On any other occasion, Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor might have begun to contend with each other for control of the remnants, but now, they were in no mood for such a thing. Where is Taoist Heavenspan? Bai Xiaochun said, scanning the vicinity. The Celestials remained silent for a moment, until Prince Demon finally spoke up. Arch-Emperor, Taoist Heavenspan has been missing for a while now. No one knows where he is. Frowning, Bai Xiaochun prepared to ask further questions, when suddenly, a heaven-rending, earth-crushing rumbling sound could be heard, filling even the furthest corners of the eternal immortal domains. It was an intense sound that seemed to contain unending death and destruction, and seemed to step from the darkest depths of the void. Something profoundly evil was coming. Bai Xiaochun, the Saint Emperor, and everyone else in the eternal immortal domains looked up into the sky, their expressions flickering. High above, the eyes of the mortal renegade were quivering. The Saint Emperor gasped, his hair standing on end as fear grew within him, stemming from his very soul, and even further, from the depths of the cycle of reincarnation. It was a sense of danger that one would experience when facing one's greatest enemy, and was shared by everyone who lived within the eternal immortal domains. Every living being couldn't help but feel unprecedented terror and shock for what the future held. The enemy from beyond moved. The legends are true. If that giant wakes up, he'll exterminate everything. Countless cries of alarm filled the world. Even the eternal sea responded, as though it had a spirit, causing wild waves to surge across its surface. Bai Xiaochun was just as shaken, and felt as if he had just laid eyes on a predestined archenemy. Considering what he had seen in the worldly Taoist's memories, his feelings were even more complex. Even as he took in a deep breath, he noticed that, as the eyelids of the mortal renegade quivered, two strips that almost looked like paper were now visible on his body. One of them stretched from his forehead to his dantian region, while the other went from his right shoulder to the same location. The strip stretching from his shoulder was roughly 20% dark, indicating that it had lost some of its power, and was only 80% effective. Worse, the strip stretching from his forehead was now 80% dim, indicating that only 20% of its power remained. Bai Xiaochun wasn't sure what those lines represented, and in that, he was not alone within the eternal immortal domains. Few people understood their significance. However, as soon as the Saint Emperor saw them, his face fell, and he began to shiver uncontrollably. One of the strips has been broken, he blurted out loud. Shaken, Bai Xiaochun focused on the strip leading from the forehead to the dantian region, and realized that it provoked fluctuations within his blood, as though the strip were somehow connected to the bloodline of the Arch-Emperor dynasty. Instantly, his pupils constricted as he put the pieces of the puzzle together. Before he could say anything, the Saint Emperor explained. There should be 3 strips. Back when the Eternal Mother created the 3 eternal sons, they fought the enemy from beyond, and gave up their lives in the process. The Eternal Mother also paid a huge price to forge 3 sealing strips, backed by the powers of the 3 bloodlines. The Saint Emperor quickly went on to provide more details, explaining everything he knew about the subject. The truth was that now that the mortal renegade was moving, it spelled impending catastrophe for the eternal immortal domains. At a time like this, the Saint Emperor didn't care at all about struggles for power. He cared about the existence of the eternal immortal domains as a whole. If the great enemy awoke, and there was no one there to stop him, then all creation would be toppled and cast into infinite darkness. Each and every one of those bloodline sealing strips is of critical importance. They were created by sovereign-level world magic, and are precisely what have kept the enemy from beyond sleeping until now. The Saint Emperor was so anxious about the matter that his words came in rapid-fire succession. There used to be a strip leading from his left shoulder to his Dantian region, which was powered by the Vile Ancestor. The strip on the right shoulder is from the Saint Ancestor, and the middle strip is from the Arch Ancestor. The Vile Ancestor's strip has already been broken, which proves that the Vile Emperor is truly dead, his bloodline suppressed and contaminated for years by the impostor. Although only one strip has been broken, that already allows the great enemy to begin to move. The strip connected to the Saint Emperor dynasty has 80% of its strength remaining. As for the strip connected to your bloodline, Arch Emperor, it has been weakened to a dangerous level, presumably because your people took so long to return, and also because of how late you reached the Archean realm. If those final 2 strips are broken, then the enemy from beyond will awaken. Even as the Saint Emperor spoke, the mortal renegade trembled, and his eyelids flickered visibly, as though he were struggling to break the final 2 bloodline sealing strips. As he struggled, the strips began to grow darker. Clearly, it would only be a few more months before they were destroyed. The death of the impostor Vile Emperor had pushed the mortal renegade past the limits of his patience. He didn't want the sealing strips to gradually wear away, he wanted to burst through them and wake up as soon as possible. What can we do to strengthen the strips? Bai Xiaochun asked. He feared death, but he knew that if the mortal renegade woke up, the entire world would be plunged into darkness. Therefore, there were 2 options at hand. Either sit around and wait to die, or do something to fight back. There's only one thing we can do. If we get close enough to enter the sealing strips, then we can use the power of our blood to reinforce them. But if we fail, then what awaits is the destruction of the eternal immortal domains. The so-called enemy from beyond possesses the terrifying might of a sovereign, power that we are no match for. As for the sealing strips, only those with the power of an Archean can do anything to bolster them. That means that we are the only 2 who can do it. The Saint Emperor's eyes were now lit with determination. Although he was usually a hypocritical, sanctimonious person, right now, he had put that aspect of his personality to rest. He had made his decision about what needed to be done. When Bai Xiaochun realized that the Saint Emperor was essentially talking about entering the body of the mortal renegade, he nearly gasped. However, now was not the time to ponder the situation. If the mortal renegade struggled to the point where the Arch Ancestor's sealing strip went completely dark, then that would leave only one remaining sealing strip. There's no time to lose, the Saint Emperor said anxiously, immediately beginning to fly at high speed toward the mortal renegade. As he rose higher and higher, a large moon sigil appeared behind him. Gritting his teeth, Bai Xiaochun flew after him. The 2 of them became bright streaks of light that shot closer and closer to the enormous mortal renegade. Eventually, they were so close that they couldn't even see his head, only his chest. As they neared, it became even easier to see how much the mortal renegade was struggling. It was almost like an earthquake, with loud rumbling sounds and incredible pressure that caused the Saint Emperor's face to go pale. As for Bai Xiaochun, his bit of sovereign aura made it a bit easier for him. Eventually, they headed in 2 different directions, the Saint Emperor going toward the sealing strip on the right shoulder, and Bai Xiaochun heading as quickly as possible toward the mortal renegade's forehead. Those were the locations of the 2 sealing strips' true origins. Soon, the Saint Emperor's expression flickered, and even Bai Xiaochun was shocked, as they found that there was some sort of invisible barrier surrounding the mortal renegade's body. Shouting, the Saint Emperor ignited his moon sigil, a life essence treasure that gave him the punch he needed to break through that barrier. Moments later, blood-colored light shone around him as he reached the sealing strip and disappeared. Bai Xiaochun had a much simpler time. He resorted to the Undying Hex, which was now powered by his Archean cultivation base. Piercing through the barrier, he appeared in front of the sealing strip tied to the arch-ancestor's bloodline. At that point, he looked back down at the lands below. Just barely visible were the people of the eternal immortal domains, craning their heads as they looked up nervously. Although most couldn't actually see him or the Saint Emperor, everyone was paying close attention to see what would happen. All of these things had happened so suddenly that it was hard to take them all in. However, Bai Xiaochun knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath, he gritted his teeth and entered the bloodline sealing strip. Down below, the cultivators in the eternal immortal domains were waiting, terrified and deeply aware of the danger they were in. However, there was nothing they could do other than wait and pray. The mortal renegade's body was massive. Right now, the only thing Bai Xiaochun could see was the bloodline sealing strip, which looked like dozens of mountain ranges lined up next to each other. In fact, it would have been difficult to even identify it were it not for the strong aura of the arch-ancestor's bloodline that it contained, which formed a resonance with him. Upon entering the sealing strip, his vision blurred for a moment. When it cleared, he looked around to find himself in a dark area that was actually one of the mortal renegade's energy passageways. It was not a natural energy passageway, but rather, one that had been forcibly created back when the three eternal suns sealed the mortal renegade. It was large, almost like an entire world, but at the moment, it was completely and utterly silent. As soon as Bai Xiaochun took form inside, he began to glow with blood-colored light. As the light swirled around him, it became a spinning vortex with him at the center. The energy passageway was withered, but as soon as the blood-colored light touched it, it perked up. At the same time, the resonance he felt grew stronger, as though he were actually the foundation of the passageway. As of that moment, Bai Xiaochun realized what he had to do to restore the power of the sealing strip. I have to become the foundation of the seal. To repair it, I have to allow the power of my bloodline to awaken its strength. I need to go to the mortal renegade's Dantian region. By the time I reach that point, the sealing strip will be completely repaired. If I perish along the way, the process will end in failure. And if I leave early, the result will be the same. Sighing, he knew that there was no backing out. He gritted his teeth and then began to fly through the energy passageway, sending blood-colored light shining out in all directions. The sooner he got to the Dantian region, the sooner the sealing mark would be repaired. Therefore, he pushed forward with all the speed he could muster. The Saint Emperor was doing the same thing in another energy passageway, speeding along and emanating light that represented the bloodline of the Saint Ancestor. Back outside in the eternal immortal domains, there were people who could see the sealing strips on the mortal renegade, and noticed the bright lights that had begun to move down them. At the same time, the struggling mortal renegade was already being forced to settle down into inactivity. Unfortunately, the process was not one that could be finished so quickly and smoothly. As Bai Xiaochun sped through the energy passageway, his eyes suddenly widened. The space up ahead of him had begun to twist and distort as several shadowy shapes materialized. There were cultivators and beasts alike, tens upon tens of thousands of them. None of them had any life force, only auras of death, and they all looked as vicious as could be imagined. When they laid eyes on Bai Xiaochun, it was as if they were seeing their greatest archenemy. Howling, they began to charge toward him in attack. Some were in the nascent soul stage, while others were on the same level as celestials, a whole cloud of powerful foes. However, none of them possessed Archean battle prowess. Therefore, Bai Xiaochun didn't even stop. Resorting to the mountain-shaking bash, he became like a shooting star that crushed everything in his path. Rumbling booms could be heard as he smashed through the shadowy specters, carving out a path through them in only the blink of an eye. However, even after being destroyed, the shadowy specters formed back together, and stopped at nothing to try to block his path. If that were all there were to it, it might not be a big deal, but with every moment that passed, more specters appeared. Soon, there were too many to count, and even the mighty Bai Xiaochun was starting to slow down due to the time and effort needed to kill them. Damn it, he growled. Quickly performing an incantation gesture, he waved his finger to summon a live forever lamp. As the power of his cultivation base then spread out, the surrounding specters also turned into live forever lamps. As they burned, he burst forward in an attempt to pass them. As he tried to break through, the shadowy specters began to shout at him. You can't escape, mortal renegade. I'm gonna kill you, mortal renegade. Even if I die, I'll make you pay, mortal renegade. At the same time, more and more specters appeared to bolster their numbers. By now, Bai Xiaochun could guess who these shadowy specters were. They were people the mortal renegade had killed in the past, and now that he was sealed, he couldn't do anything to prevent them from appearing. Although they didn't have the same battle prowess as when they were alive, they were still eternally indestructible. As more and more appeared, Bai Xiaochun's anxiety mounted. Unleashing the power of his Archean cultivation base, he summoned a tempest around him, then charged forward, mowing down anyone who got in his path. Occasionally he would use the mountain-shaking bash, and occasionally his live forever lamp. Eventually, he performed an incantation gesture and unleashed his sutra of the former. Countless magical symbols appeared, sealing the shadowy specters. Unable to free themselves from the sea of magical symbols, the shadowy specters struggled in vain as Bai Xiaochun shot past them. Not looking back, he proceeded forward as quickly as possible. As he flew onward, he summoned hosts of lightning bolts which would instantly crush any shadowy specters he encountered. And thus, he made his way along the energy passageway. The Saint Emperor had also encountered similar shadowy specters. His methods were different than Bai Xiaochun, but he was also a powerful Archean, and was able to maintain top speed. His moon sigil sent beams of moonlight out in front of him, carving a path as he proceeded along, shining with blood-colored light. Occasionally, he would summon lotus flowers, which would instantly crush the hosts of shadowy specters that surrounded him. The Saint Emperor was not holding anything back. Now that the vile emperor had been unmasked as a clone, and the huge sovereign was on the verge of waking up, he knew that a deadly crisis was brewing. Everything he had said to Bai Xiaochun had been completely and utterly true. Many eyes in the eternal immortal domains were focused on the two ceiling strips on the mortal renegade. Of course, the light representing the Saint Emperor had been brighter to begin with, and was more so now. And the Saint Emperor was also much closer to the Dantian region, being nearly halfway there. The ceiling strip from the Arch-Ancestor had been reduced by 80%, and although Bai Xiaochun was successfully repairing it, it was still far behind the other one. Everyone was watching nervously, including the Grand Heaven Master and other people who were close to Bai Xiaochun. Solemn, shaken expressions could be seen everywhere. This development had been too sudden, and yet, that was what had given Bai Xiaochun and the Saint Emperor this one chance to repair the ceiling strips. After all, if the imposter vile emperor hadn't been killed, then his plan would have continued smoothly, and the eternal immortal domains would have soon faced a deadly, apocalyptic catastrophe. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.